A society is not merely a collection of individuals living in the present moment. It is not simply an agreement among the breathing. Edmund Burke, the 18th century statesman and philosopher, proposed something far more profound: that society is an eternal partnership, a contract binding not only those who walk the earth today, but also those who came before and those who have yet to be born. This is the primeval contract. It fundamentally reframes the moral foundation of governance, the nature of rights, and the purpose of political institutions. Burke articulated this vision most clearly in his Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790. His argument emerged as a direct response to revolutionary fervor, to the belief that each generation could remake society from first principles, severing ties with the past in pursuit of abstract ideals. Burke rejected this. He insisted that legitimate political authority rests not on the momentary will of the living, but on an intergenerational covenant that stretches across time. This script examines the structure of that covenant, its philosophical underpinnings, and its consequences for how power should be exercised and policy should be designed. Edmund Burke was born in Dublin in 1729 and spent most of his career in British politics, serving as a member of Parliament for nearly 3 decades. He was neither a systematic philosopher nor an academic theorist. He was a working politician, a rhetorician, and a moral thinker who confronted practical crises. His thought developed in response to concrete events: the American Revolution, British colonial administration in India, and most dramatically, the French Revolution. Burke is often labeled a conservative, and in one sense this is accurate. He defended tradition, continuity, and inherited institutions. But his conservatism was not a defense of stasis. He supported gradual reform, opposed tyranny, and argued passionately for limits on arbitrary power. He believed in change, but change rooted in organic development rather than revolutionary rupture. The primeval contract appears in Reflections on the Revolution in France, Burke's most famous work. The French Revolution had begun in 1789, with the storming of the Bastille and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Many intellectuals in Britain and across Europe celebrated these events as the dawn of rational governance, the overthrow of superstition and despotism. Burke saw something else. He saw the dangerous consequences of treating society as a blank slate, subject to redesign by philosophical abstraction. Revolutionary thinking, Burke argued, rested on a flawed conception of social contract theory. Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau had popularized the idea that legitimate government arises from a contract among individuals. People surrender certain freedoms in exchange for protection and order. This was a powerful idea, but Burke saw it as incomplete and potentially catastrophic when taken to its logical extreme. If society is merely a contract among the living, then the living possess unlimited authority to rewrite the terms. They can discard customs, abolish institutions, and liquidate the inheritance of the past in the name of reason or justice. Burke rejected this. He argued that society is not a commercial transaction, limited in scope and duration. It is not a contract for temporary convenience, dissoluble at will. It is something far older, deeper, and more sacred. Burke's primeval contract is a partnership in perpetuity. In his words, society is a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. This partnership is not entered into lightly, nor can it be dissolved by a single generation acting in isolation. Each generation inherits obligations from the past and owes duties to the future. The living are custodians, not owners. The dead are part of this contract because they built the institutions, laws, and cultural frameworks that make present life possible. They cleared the land, established the language, codified the laws, and fought the battles that secured stability. Their labor, sacrifices, and accumulated wisdom are embedded in the fabric of society. To discard this inheritance is not liberation, it is ingratitude and folly. The dead have no voice, but they have claims. They have bequeathed a legacy, and the living have an obligation to honor it, to preserve what is valuable, and to transmit it forward. The unborn are part of this contract because society does not end with the present generation. Policies enacted today will shape the world decades or centuries hence. Laws passed now will constrain or enable future generations. Resources consumed today are unavailable tomorrow. Environmental degradation, public debt, institutional decay, all of these impose burdens on people who cannot yet speak for themselves. Burke insisted that governance must account for these future citizens. The unborn have rights, though they cannot articulate them. They have interests, though they cannot defend them. The living must act as their representatives. This triadic structure, living, dead, unborn, creates a moral architecture for politics. It imposes humility. It demands that those in power recognize the limits of their authority. No generation possesses absolute sovereignty. No parliament, no monarch, no revolutionary assembly can claim the right to tear down everything and start anew. They are stewards, not despots. Burke contrasted this with the revolutionary ethos of his time. The French revolutionaries, he argued, treated society as if it were a machine that could be disassembled and reassembled according to rational blueprints. They believed that human reason, freed from tradition, could design perfection. Burke found this arrogant and dangerous. Human reason is powerful, but it is also limited, prone to error, and susceptible to hubris. Tradition, by contrast, embodies the tested wisdom of countless generations. It is the distilled knowledge of what has worked, refined through trial and error over centuries. This does not mean that tradition is infallible. Burke was not opposed to reform. He supported the American colonists, resistance to arbitrary British taxation. He advocated for Catholic relief in Ireland. He condemned abuses in the British East India Company's administration of India, but reform, in Burke's view, must be undertaken carefully, with respect for existing structures, and with an eye toward preserving continuity. It must be organic, not revolutionary. The primeval contract also carries a spiritual dimension. Burke described it as a contract between God and man. He believed that society rests on moral truths that transcend human invention. Rights and duties are not merely social constructs, created by agreement and dissoluble by consensus. They are rooted in a higher order, a natural law that governs human affairs. This does not require adherence to any particular religious doctrine, but it does require acknowledgement that moral principles are not arbitrary. They are discovered, not invented. This spiritual or metaphysical grounding provides stability. If rights are merely conventional, if they exist only because the living have agreed to recognize them, then they can be abolished by the living. If future generations decide otherwise, rights vanish. But if rights are grounded in something deeper, something beyond the whims of the present, then they possess a permanence that constrains political power. The living cannot simply vote away fundamental principles. Burke's view also implies a particular conception of liberty. Liberty is not the absence of constraint. It is not the freedom to do whatever one wishes. It is, rather, the ability to live within a stable, just, and ordered society. Liberty requires institutions that protect individuals from arbitrary power. It requires customs that guide behavior. It requires laws that limit both rulers and ruled. These institutions, customs, and laws are inherited. They were built over generations. To destroy them in the name of abstract freedom is to undermine the very conditions that make real freedom possible. Consider the inheritance of a family estate. A generation receives land, structures, and resources accumulated by ancestors. Those who inherit the estate do not own it in an absolute sense. They are caretakers. They have the right to use it, to improve it, and to enjoy its benefits. But they also have obligations. They must maintain the structures, preserve the fertility of the land, and pass it on to the next generation in good condition, or better than they found it. If the current generation decides to liquidate all assets, sell the timber, exhaust the soil, and spend the proceeds on immediate pleasures, they have violated the implicit contract. They have consumed the inheritance without regard for those who built it or those who will follow. They have acted as if the estate exists solely for their benefit. This is theft across time. Burke saw society in precisely these terms: political institutions, legal traditions, cultural norms. All of these are the estate that each generation inherits. The living may enjoy the fruits, but they must also tend the roots. They may adapt and improve, but they may not destroy. This analogy illuminates the difference between stewardship and ownership. Ownership implies the right to dispose of property as one sees fit. Stewardship implies responsibility, care, and accountability to others. Burke's political philosophy is a philosophy of stewardship. Burke's concept of the primeval contract has direct implications for contemporary governance. Consider environmental policy. Climate change is a problem whose causes are rooted in the decisions of the living and the recent dead, but whose most severe consequences will fall on the unborn. Fossil fuel consumption, deforestation, and industrial emissions impose costs on future generations who had no part in creating the problem. A Burkean framework demands that current policy account for these future burdens. The unborn are stakeholders. Their interests must be represented, even though they cannot vote. Similarly, public debt raises intergenerational questions. When governments borrow heavily to finance current spending, they transfer costs to future taxpayers. Those future taxpayers inherit the obligation to service the debt but may not benefit from the expenditures that generated it. A Burkean approach would scrutinize such practices. It would ask whether the debt finances investments that genuinely benefit future generations, infrastructure, education, research, or whether it merely funds present consumption at future expense. Constitutional design also reflects Burkean principles. Many constitutional systems include provisions that are difficult to amend. These provisions entrench certain rights, procedures, or structures, placing them beyond the reach of temporary majorities. This is not anti-democratic. It is, rather, an acknowledgement that some principles are too fundamental to be subject to the passions of the moment. It is a mechanism for protecting the contract with the dead and the unborn. Burke's thought also informs debates over cultural heritage. Should statues be removed? Should place names be changed? Should historical narratives be revised? A Burkean perspective does not automatically oppose such changes, but it insists on caution. It asks whether the changes sever continuity, erase memory, or dishonor legitimate contributions. It recognizes that the past is imperfect, but it also insists that wholesale repudiation of the past is dangerous. The primeval contract also challenges purely utilitarian approaches to policy. Utilitarianism seeks to maximize welfare, typically understood as the well-being of the living. But if society is a partnership across time, then welfare calculations must extend beyond the present. They must include the interests of the dead, whose sacrifices and achievements deserve respect, and the interests of the unborn, whose lives will be shaped by present choices. Burke's vision is not without tension. Critics argue that it can be used to justify inertia, to defend unjust hierarchies, and to resist necessary progress. If every generation is bound by the past, how can oppressive systems ever be reformed? If the dead have claims on the living, does this not privilege conservatism over justice? These are legitimate concerns. Burke himself recognized that tradition could harbor injustice. But his answer was not to abandon tradition wholesale. It was to reform carefully, to distinguish between what is worth preserving and what must be changed, and to ensure that reform strengthens rather than destroys the intergenerational contract. The challenge lies in balancing continuity with progress, respect for the past with responsibility to the future. Another critique centers on the metaphysical assumptions underlying Burke's thought. Modern secular societies may resist the notion that society rests on a contract with God, or that moral truths are discovered rather than constructed. But even without theological grounding, the core insight remains compelling. Governance is not merely about satisfying present preferences, it involves obligations across time. Edmund Burke's primeval contract offers a counterweight to the temporal myopia that often characterizes political life. It insists that society is not a machine to be redesigned at will, nor a marketplace governed solely by present transactions. It is an inheritance, a trust, and a covenant. The living are neither slaves to the past nor free to ignore the future. They occupy a position of responsibility, standing between what has been and what will be. This framework does not provide easy answers. It does not resolve every policy dilemma or settle every constitutional dispute. But it provides a moral compass. It reminds those in power that their authority is limited, that their actions have consequences beyond their lifetimes, and that the measure of good governance is not merely present satisfaction, but enduring stability and justice. In an age of rapid change, short-term thinking, and presentist bias, Burke's vision remains urgently relevant. It calls for a politics of memory and foresight, a politics that honors the dead and protects the unborn, a politics that understands society not as a temporary arrangement, but as an eternal society.